Welcome to the Hank Cisco, Hank Cisco show. Ladies and gentlemen, please don't touch that dial. I have a special guest today. Well, it isn't how many times you get knocked down, it's how many times you get up. Manja. Okay. Go to right, you gotta throw the shoulder around with it. Right? Hey, okay, thank you, and God bless each and every one.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the Hank Cisco Show. Let's go.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Hank Cisco Show 2020, entering its 32nd year, at least the 32nd year. I'm Stan Casascio, your host for the show, and today we're pleasure to have our forensic scientist par excellence, Art Young, who is going to give us some real interesting backgrounds on the art of forensic science, which, as you know, today there's TV shows and movies and everybody's relying on DNA, but we're going to get the real inside story on this. So Art, what I'd like to do is, you're a Chinese American, but I understand it's a real interesting story how your parents came here to this country, and I think it's real important for people to understand that story and the impact that's had on your life. So why don't you tell people a little bit about yourself and how you came here?
Sure. Well, my mother's side of the family specifically came from Fujian province in China.
Is that north of Peiping, or near, where is that located in relation to some of the bigger cities?
I couldn't tell you where it is in relation to the other cities. Basically, it's inland, and it's kind of around the middle of the country. And anyway, when the communist takeover happened in the 1950s, they fled. And so they fled to Hong Kong. They had sold everything that they had so that they could buy the trip to go to Hong Kong. Once they were in Hong Kong, they settled for a little while. They worked, they saved their money, and then it was time to make another jump. They sold everything that they had, and they moved to Taiwan, where they settled for a little bit, worked, saved their money, and then eventually they came to the United States in, I think it was 1962, entering in through New York, and I was born in Manhattan.
In Manhattan. So did they came through the process in New York? Obviously Ellis Island wasn't there anymore, but there was. How did they get the sponsorship to get here? Or they just came as political refugees to a degree?
I think political refugees to a degree. That part is a little fuzzy from my parents, didn't get that much detail.
And your parents still with us today?
No. Both of my parents have passed away.
Okay.
So anyway, they once they arrived, they did what they did. They had restaurants, they had small shops. My mother was a restaurateur. At the peak of her empire, she had 3 restaurants going, and eventually sold them all off and retired and still puttered around.
So you worked your way into the kitchen. And I know you do make a couple of really good desserts. I know that from personal experience. I know your Jello shots are very unique and they run the gamut. But I understand you're pretty good at dumplings and a bunch of other things too.
Well, yeah, I basically had decided that I'm sort of the mutant in the family, if you will. Most of my family are in business, restaurants. I literally learned to walk in a restaurant. And however, I was the mutant and I was a scientist. I was a pre-med major in college. And
by the way, I just had this vision, you working in the kitchen with your flask and everything else, making the food.
That's what my house looks like now.
That's what your house looks like.
When I'm doing Jello shots,
yeah.
Okay, and I'm creating new ones. For example, the last one that came off the drawing board was a creme brulee Jello shot. And I had the formula worked out. The last trick was flame broiling the sugar on the top, and I had these little plastic souffle cups to serve the Jell-O shots in. And when it came time to flame it, the one part that I missed was protecting the plastic from the flamethrower. Yeah. I had a little aluminum foil shield to put on top, but what I didn't count on was that the aluminum would get so hot that the plastic could still melt.
That's good. That's good.
So I missed that one. Yeah, I enjoy playing around in the kitchen and basically combining my scientific training with the culinary part.
So as we move along, so you're now born in Manhattan and you're working in the kitchens, and as you say, you're the mutant of the family. But then how do you go from kitchen to mad scientist? And then how do you do from mad scientist go in this field of forensic science, which, when I see a TV show like Bones, a CSI, some of these movies, I go, wow, that scientist is really good. He's got it nailed, exactly what happened, the time of the day, knows everything that's going on. How did you make that leap from there?
As I said, I was a pre-med major in college. As I grew up, I was fascinated by science and in particular medicine. And so I wanted to become a physician. However, in 1991, when I graduated college, healthcare reform was a major issue, and healthcare reform had almost passed as legislation.
It was back in the 90s.
Yeah. And so now it became very clear you could go into medical school and the field and practice of medicine would be one way, but by the time you come out 4 years later, if this legislation had passed, you would have seen something very, very different. So I wanted to sit on the sidelines and see what would happen. I actually had a friend who worked for the coroner's office, and so I thought that I would intern with the coroner's office for the summer.
Was that, where would coroner's office, in New York or?
No. I was living in Louisiana at the time.
Louisiana. So you're in Louisiana, in the coroner's office in Louisiana.
Yeah. Among my other skills, I picked up Cajun cooking, so I make a pretty good gumbo for a Chinese person anyway. So
could be an interesting restaurant if you ever give up the other stuff, but back to the more mundane.
Oh, you should have seen it Thanksgiving, actually. I was screwing around with a friend of mine, and he asked me if I and my family celebrated Thanksgiving. And I just decided to screw with him, and I said, yeah, but we put a little Chinese twist on it. So we have like turkey and stuffing, but we roll them up into egg rolls with gravy and cranberry sauce for dipping. And we also take mashed sweet potato, and put them into wontons and deep fry them, dust them with sugar. And as I was going on, I started saying, you know what? Actually, these were really, really good. And so I actually made
some for his.
I made them 1 year, and now I do it with leftovers every year. Let me tell you, if you haven't lived until you've had a macaroni and cheese and bacon egg roll.
I will definitely have to try that. It's opened up a whole new world for me. So you're working in this in the coroner's office in Louisiana, and all of a sudden, light bulb goes off. You say, "Wow, this is interesting."
Well, I went to him for an internship, but that didn't happen. They couldn't take me. But he said, "You know what? You actually probably belong with the sheriff's office at the crime scene unit." So he gave me a name, a number, and directions. I went down there and talked with them, and the contact person said, you know what, we need to talk to the sheriff. And so she took me straight to the sheriff and said, we need to hire this kid. He's got a bachelor's degree in pre-medical sciences. He would be great to do crime scene work. Unfortunately, they weren't hiring at the time. So they said, you know what, you actually should talk to the people down at the crime lab. And I said, we have a crime lab here. I didn't know that. But they gave me a name and a number, made a phone call, had a tour. I learned that they were hiring, and so I decided to apply for the job, and I got it. Yeah. And the rest has been history.
So, you see a lot of the TV shows and things like that, and I guess you sit there and either throw popcorn at the screen and say, oh, these people are crazy. But in real life, what is there kind of a what's the big difference that they do in between the real life when you get to a crime scene? And I know you do other stuff besides crime. I mean, you people who have been in terrible accidents, identifying people that are in terrible accidents. I know you had a few cases like that. I've known you got some cases you can't even talk about because of confidentiality, some of which are very big names that very interesting stuff. And I know you do some pro bono work on victims that may have been accused of crimes, and the families have contacted you. I'm thinking of Dr. Bodden recently, who was talking about Epstein's thing. And I know you and I talked about the O.J. Simpson case
Sure.
one night at dinner, and you flabbergasted me. I had to fell off the floor when you told me your answer. But so let's talk a little bit about that. You get a call, you got to go to a crime scene. Tell me what it's like as compared to what you see in the movies.
Well, there's an expression, I think it's in the general community, but it's especially true in forensic science. Any phone call that happens after 11 p.m. is usually not good. And in this line of work, when the phone rings after 11 p.m., it usually means there's a crime scene. And I've had that happen a couple of times. Most of the time, however, the police are securing the scene, and I get there usually at daylight because we're looking for evidence, and unless you want to go walking around with a flashlight all night long, you may as well just wait for dawn.
I would assume also then that what would happen there is it's a possibility you could contaminate it accidentally because you're not knowing, the extent of the crime scene too.
Sure. I remember as a young man, the very first time that I got called to a crime scene, it was a parole officer who had a meeting with one of his parolees, and it was sometime at night, and it was out in the middle of nowhere, and the parole officer got shot. And so when we arrived, we were trying to process the scene, and they told us when we first arrived that we can't secure the scene because it's just an open field. And I turned to my supervisor and I said, "What does that mean, they can't secure the scene?" And they said, my supervisor said, "It means that you could be shot, that the shooter might still be around." And I said, "Oh, great. Nice first crime scene." First crime scene
is a possibility you get shot by the guy who's still out there in the field somewhere.
Exactly. So that's a little unsettling, but it was a field, and so there's grass about knee high. There's really not much point in searching for something like that till the sun comes up, because you could be looking for things like drops of blood, ejected shell casings from the firearm. That we would be looking for because that would tell us where the shooter shot from. But when it's a giant field with knee-high grass, you can miss a lot of things.
Now, I understand that and of course the field of DNA and your forensic has gone through the roof as far as this stuff. But I understand that even if criminals are wearing gloves, that if there's contact between humans or contact that some DNA always gets transferred, some form of transfer happens no matter what. Is that true?
Basically, yes, because, and this is the one thing, my biggest gripe about what you see on TV. There'll be a body lying there, detectives come walking up in high-heeled shoes and silk blouses, like we all do that, yeah, right. Most of the time we're wearing jeans because you never know what's going to happen. And so you want to be comfortable, but you also want to be able to stretch, to be able to move freely. So biggest gripe, number one, TV is how they dress. Number two, you'll see the detective reach into his or her pocket and pull out a pair of gloves and put on latex gloves. Yeah, we don't do that either, because you see, your pockets, every time you stick your hand in your pocket, you're depositing DNA from your hand into the lining of your pocket. And so when you put the gloves in your pocket, that DNA is now transferring to the exterior of the gloves. So they're now contaminated. When you go and touch something same thing happens. Perhaps a more graphic but understandable situation is you go to a sandwich shop, the little sandwich maker puts on gloves, and then the sandwich maker sneezes. And if the sandwich maker goes back to making your sandwich, you now have a concern, don't you?
Yes, obviously.
Well, criminals are not much better. They will put on gloves thinking that they're going to outsmart us, but then they'll do things like put their hands in their pockets, or they'll wipe sweat off their face. And congratulations, we now have your DNA on the gloves. We just need to see what you touch next. Mm-hmm. And that is very easy to do. We know these things because of surveillance video. You have home security surveillance video or a business where you can see what these people did. You can see that they touched the doorknob.
Even if they had the gloves on, you can get a sense of what they're touching, and then there's the transfer.
Right.
So now how do you find that minuscule piece of DNA that these people have touched? I mean, it's not visible in any sense of the imagination, at least to the naked eye generally.
Correct. There are a variety of ways. Okay, your DNA is being deposited everywhere, all the time, constantly. It's just being able to figure out your DNA versus someone else who may have been in contact with that surface, let's say the day before, because we can't tell when the DNA was deposited. So basically you just swab the surface. But we do have to be a little bit more careful, because we might want to ask the question, how did the DNA get on here? I had a case recently where a gun was recovered from a couch, and the police officers had picked up the gun and put it into evidence bag, and that was fine. But one question we have to ask is, this is a couch. There's DNA on the couch. We should probably take a sample from the couch to see whose DNA is there, because that might explain transfer to the gun.
I get you. So it's not just doing certain things, asking the right question during the case to make sure that you got the right answer to find these things.
This job is always about asking questions.
Always about asking, and the right questions.
Right.
And the right questions. Now, you know, one of the things that I wanted to talk about is your work can be very dark.
Yes.
It can be very dark because it's really about some of the worst of human nature that happens, whether it's a crime of passion or a crime that's planned or whatever crime it's done. Do you get involved now? You know, on TV they handle, you know, especially CSI and some of the other ones there, you know, rape and murders and things of that. Do you get involved in those cases at all?
Yes, we do. We get involved with homicides. We get involved with sexual assaults, kidnapping, basically any sort of crime that you've seen on TV, we've been involved with. In fact, some of my cases have made it to TV.
Some of your cases have made it to TV?
Yeah, one was actually the basis for a CSI episode.
No, are you allowed to say which one that was?
Yeah.
Which?
Well, the case originated. The case in the CSI show was about an actress who had contracted HIV, and she infected her boyfriend, who was also the director, and he became enraged because he became infected, and he murders her. So I had a case where a woman she was attacked by her boyfriend/lover. She had told him that after 7 years of their affair, that she was ending it. She understood that he was not going to leave his wife, and so she ended it. She was a nurse in his office because he was a physician. And one night he entered the bedroom and injected her with HIV-positive blood. And so that case was the basis of the CSI episode. And what we had to do was compare the DNA from the virus that she had with the patient that the blood was drawn from and look at the DNA profiles of the two. As a scientific matter, of course, because you remember I said, this job is entirely about asking questions and asking the right questions. Well, is it possible that she contracted the virus from somebody else in the population? That's entirely possible. So I had gone to the local AIDS support group. There were 27 people there. I pled my case and I asked for blood samples from each person, and every single one of them gave me a blood sample. And all of those samples had been analyzed, all of them had been compared, none of them were identical to the victim and the patient that the blood came from. So we now proved that this was actually true.
That is an incredible timeline how you went through that. How long did that process take? It doesn't happen overnight. I'm sure it took several months.
Well, that would probably be complaint number 3 about CSI on TV, the time frame.
Right. We got to get it done in an hour.
Yeah. Well, in the episode, as I'm watching this unfold, I said, if they say phylogenetic analysis, I'm going to quit watching this show because they just did in 5 minutes what took us 5 years. It took us 5 years to, from the start of the investigation all the way to its prosecution was 5 years.
Mm-hmm. How did he get the sample of the HIV? Did he have a patient that was HIV?
Yes, and the doctor's office, the case is tried, and if you look, he was a gastroenterologist in Louisiana by the name of Dr. Richard Schmidt.
Wow.
And he had...
I guess he figured he had the perfect crime.
Yes, and in fact he had been interviewed by detectives, and they had asked him, why did you decide to do it this way? And the answer was, I didn't think you could catch me. And you know what? He would have been right. Except the one thing that just happened to be was that at the crime lab at the time was a former pre-med major who happened to spend an entire semester studying virology. And so in the late 80s, this was all anybody was talking about. What I knew was that there were 5 or 6 different strains in the world. And so if you can tell 5 or 6 different strains of HIV, there has to be a way of telling them apart. And that was the thread that I began pulling on to find the technique that could discriminate between the two.
Interesting. I tell you what, I almost want to turn the clock back and become a forensic scientist because it just seems like so interesting. Now, even though you have a lot of dark and grim stories, is there anything that ever happened that was kind of funny that happens in this field at all?
Oh yeah, we get these stories all the time. You know, professional conferences where after the day is over, the talks have been done, and we're sitting around at dinner, glasses of wine, etc., and we just tell each other, you know, what happened. And probably one of my favorite ones was a friend of mine named Alex, and he was a biologist similar to myself, and he had this sexual assault kit, and he started examining the evidence, and he had this bag, and the bag said underwear. So he lays out a new sheet of paper. He takes the bag, dumps the garment out on it, stretches it out, and he looks at it, and he turns it upside down, flips it over, turns it upside down again, and then he turns it inside out, puts it down, flips it over. Basically, he's looking at it from all the angles, and then he just sits there staring at it. Now, Julia, another colleague, was at her desk a few feet away, and she saw that Alex was just sitting there staring at this thing, and she comes over and she says, "Alex, are you okay?" And Alex looks at the underwear and he goes, "I can't figure out where the crotch of the underwear is." And Julia looks at the underwear, looks at him, realizes that Alex isn't kidding, okay? And she goes, "Alex, that's a sports bra."
so, so he totally, he needs a lot of help. He's been way too much time in the lab.
Well, sometimes, the forensic science is really just kind of this shadow version of the world that you live in. And so we need to be able to, we can't just call it underwear, okay? We have to be able to say, well, is it regular female underwear? Is it like a boys' briefs? Is it a thong, or is it a G-string, etc.? These are all different terms for different styles of underwear, and you need to be able to use the terms correctly.
Now, as you know, we have a number of young people here, filming this thing, and I give them a lot of credit for the work that they've done over the years that I've been doing this show. I'm very impressed with all the students that have done this. A young person who's trying to figure out what they want to do in life and maybe inclined to a science or a medical thing, what kind of recommendations would you make to them if they want to turn their attention to? What do you have to like doing this job?
The first thing that you have to like is science. You would need to focus on science in high school and go to college and get a degree in one of the sciences, either biology, chemistry, physics. These days, it's now 2020. A lot of universities have forensic science programs.
So you can actually step into
You can actually major in forensic science these days. So you would need to do one of those. Personally, I think that you should major in one of the regular sciences, because easily in any given year, there are more graduates of forensic science programs than there are jobs available in this field. So you don't really want to spend all your time with a forensic science major and end up not getting into the field. So if you have a biology or a chemistry degree, you can still get into the field, but you can also still have other avenues. Maybe you'll go into pharmaceuticals or research, cancer research, things like that. So that would be number one, the educational background. Number two, you have to love a mystery. You just have to. There's no way that you can really stand to do this job if you were just satisfied with not knowing. You have to be able to look at a case and to be able to lay the photographs out and study the photographs.
Well, let me go back to the case with the doctor injecting his affair lover with HIV because she was going to leave him. What gave you that thought process that said something's not right here? This was more than just what it seems to be, that this woman had an affair with a person with HIV. What gave you that inkling to go one step further?
Well, the first step was to try and find the method, because I was a scientist and I'm trying to prove or disprove what she was saying. Because maybe, as they say, people lie all the time, and maybe sometimes she's lying. So I need to consider, well, maybe there's another explanation.
So she's still alive, and she doesn't know how she got it.
Well, she specifically pointed to that night, because the events of that night was that she was in her bedroom. It was 10 o'clock at night, and she heard the door to the bedroom open. So this is why she wasn't able to see what was in the syringe, because the lights were off. But this is also a very peculiar situation. Why would a person that you just dumped come into your bedroom at night to give you an injection of B12? So that's when there was a struggle.
So that's when, and that's where the questions arise. Now it was how to prove it, and he thought he had the perfect crime.
Right.
Yeah.
Because by the time she realized what it was, she had become HIV positive, but this was about 4 or 5 months later. The syringe is gone. We have no traces. What we did have was a date. We knew what day this assault happened. And at the time, HIV supposedly could only survive for 24 hours outside of the body. So we knew that the blood had to have been drawn within that period, let's say up to 48 hours prior. The most likely person would have been a patient of the office, so the investigators had looked at the records of all the patients who came in who had blood drawn. Now, there's a particular technique that the office had where they would take something called a twin code. And this is just a roll of labels, and it has two labels, one with a 4-digit number and another 4-digit number, exactly identical. And one label goes on the tube, the other label goes into a book next to the patient's name. Now, in my work, I actually spent part of my undergrad processing film. So we had the same thing. We would take a twin code, put it on the roll of film. You remember rolls of film, right?
Right. Yes, I do remember rolls of film.
All right.
Still have some of them.
So one label goes on the roll of film, and the other one goes on the bag that you filled out with your name. So I'm familiar with twin codes. But one thing I said was, well, twin codes aren't random. They're normally sequential. So if what we need to do is figure out what the twin code was that was next to this particular patient's name. Because in 2 days of collecting samples from patients, there were, let's say, 25 patients, but there was only one who didn't have a twin code next to his name.
And it was this guy.
And that's the one who turned out to be HIV positive.
So it's really, like you say, you need to ask the right questions. You got to have this urge to solve a mystery and things like that. But before we wrap up the show, there are a couple things I want to talk about. Two things that I know that right now you're doing a pro bono thing on a death row person who was actually executed. And I understand the family has asked you to look into, and you're doing it pro bono, which I give you a lot of kudos for that, to look in, because the family claims that he's innocent, or he was innocent. Can you talk a little bit about that? Are you allowed to talk about that?
A little bit.
Yeah.
The person was convicted, and the person was executed. His daughter has continued the campaign for her father's innocence. And right now we're at a phase where we want to be able to get access to the evidence to perform DNA analysis. However, there is a opposition from the state to surrender that evidence to us in order for us to do the DNA analysis. And we've said, look, if the reason why there's opposition is because you're afraid of the cost, we will take that cost off the table. We will do the analysis for free.
Mm-hmm. So you're hoping to get an answer on that.
Right.
And another thing is you have a partner, Catherine, who works with you, and she's also a forensic scientist. You're also doing work in Nigeria, doing work in Nigeria. Talk a little bit about that
Sure.
work that you do there.
Well, the nation of Nigeria had wanted to set up their own crime lab. Because they don't have one, they mostly send the samples out, usually to the UK or to the US, for analysis. But when it comes time for trial, you have to bring these people into the country. So Nigeria wanted to have their own crime lab, and there had been attempts to do it. But they basically were fruit that died on the vine. And when I was approached about this project, I said, well, yeah, I can understand why, because you can't just drop a crime lab out of the sky and expect everyone to know what to do with it. What you're going to have to do is have a long-term investment in this. It's going to take, let's say, 2 years, where in that 2 years' time, we will train police officers on how to recognize evidence, how to collect, how to preserve, and how to submit evidence. The laboratory will do the analysis and send out a report, but now you have to train the attorneys, prosecutors and defense attorneys on what these lab reports mean.
So this is a really all-encompassing type of thing from scratch, just about,
Exactly.
that you're doing.
Exactly, because consider also, even if you have the police officers and the prosecutors and defense attorneys trained. Well, the judges don't know anything about DNA, and so they're going to need training. But then the last piece was legislators, because the country has no laws governing how DNA is going to be collected, how this information is going to be processed, how it's going to be preserved. And so these were 4 prongs of attack that we had to have, and that's what the 2-year term was. And then the plan was over the next 2 years, we would begin handing over phases of operations every quarter until at the end of year 4, they were in complete operation of the whole thing.
So you go over there for several weeks at a time just to work through whatever issues that are up there and things of that nature?
Usually it's 1 or 2 weeks at a time, once or twice a year. I've got another trip coming up next month, actually.
Oh, great. Well, maybe I'll have to go with you. That'd be interesting to go there, get all my shots. Now, before we close up the thing, one question I've got to ask you, and maybe the other people out here. Did O.J. do it?
I'm going to say probably not. Based on the evidence that we had and the evidence that we had looked at, and I don't mean like the physical evidence, I'm talking about we had done, my partner Catherine specifically, had done research into the Simpson case as part of her master's thesis.
Right, I remember her telling us that.
That information suggests no. He was there to clean up afterwards, but he was not the one who committed the murder.
And I think Catherine told me one time, which made me fall off a chair, was his son did it, in her estimate, her guess.
Correct.
And he was there to clean it. And of course, the son, I think, passed away, or was...
I'm not sure, but there was I remember that there was a show on cable, I think it was Discovery Channel, it was a 6-part documentary, talking about new evidence that had come up, and it was the same evidence that Catherine had reviewed.
Well, I hope people enjoyed the show today. I found it very interesting about it. And I'd just like to say, I'm going to leave you with, before we go out, I'd like to leave you with a thought, one of Hank Cisco's sayings. There's 2 things bad for your heart: running upstairs and running down people. So keep that in mind on your day-to-day activity. And we'll look for you next week. Art, I'd like to thank you for showing up today and giving us, maybe we'll have you back to do a little bit more in detail. And you'll see Art's information if anybody who looks at the show is interested, any young people looked at the show, if they'd like to give Art a call, email him. He'll be glad to give you some direction as to getting involved in the forensic science field. So Art, thank you very much for showing up. Appreciate it very much. Thank you. We'll see you next week.